few weeks ago, I was in the USA. I had the privilege of escorting 50 or so bankers on a charity trekking expedition to the Grand Canyon. We travelled about 5,000 miles to get there, so about a day and a half, to see with our own eyes this wonder of nature that most of us had only ever experienced before indirectly through photos and film. And when we get there, with the majesty of the canyon spread out before us, a funny thing happens. Within an instant, and almost in unison, like some sort of medieval army readying their weapons for combat, out come the smartphones. In this ever-connected world that we're living in, I sometimes wonder if we might be missing out on another kind of connection, that we might be increasingly disconnected from the places that we are right now, one step removed, if you like, at arm's length. And that's not to say I'm blaming the technology. I have more than most probably benefited from its advances over the years. I spent most of my 20s living and travelling abroad, and technology was the way I was able to continue my passion and still keep in touch with friends and family back home. I inherited this passion from mum and dad. There they are. An Egyptian father, a Dutch mother. Their eyes met in a sleazy nightclub in Leicester Square. I think it's called Equinox now, if anyone's ever heard of it. But with all the world to choose from, they decided that they were going to raise their family in Essex. So I went on my first big adventure in the year 2000, and I took my first personal email address for that event. In the years that followed, my work took me to 25 plus countries, leading trekking, cycling, and overland adventures. And as the years went by, the way in which I communicated with people back home evolved. I was in Jordan the first time I used Instant Messenger, for example. I built my MySpace account from a Tibetan cyber cafe. It took me about 5 hours. I was living in Patagonia when Skype came along and blew my mind, saved me a fortune in phone bills, and allowed me to somehow maintain the 7-year long-distance relationship with the lady that I call my wife. She is actually my wife, it's not just something I call her. But as smartphones and social media have started to play a bigger and bigger part of our lives, I sometimes wonder if our reliance on them is becoming a bit of a habit, or dare I say, an addiction. Well, I'm here to tell you that I, for one, am an addict. As with any sort of addiction, the first step is really in acknowledging that you have a problem. So I wonder if, just by show of hands, you could tell me if any of the following applies to you. Do you check your emails between opening your eyes and going for that first pee of the morning? Come on, hands up. We all do it. Have you ever been inattentive to someone you care about, sharing something important to them because you've been flicking through Facebook or looking at amusing videos of cats? It's most of us, right. Have you ever crashed, and by crashed I mean written off, one or more vehicles, arguably as a result of using your phone while driving?
Of course not.
On your honeymoon? Looks like that one's just me then. According to Ofcom, we spend almost 9 hours a day consuming media. We now consume media for more hours than we sleep. 40% of us check our emails during the night, and we spend more time checking our emails than eating breakfast in the morning. And there are side effects. The blurred lines between when a working day starts and finishes leads more people to burnout than ever before. And for those of us that are habitual users, we're more likely to suffer from mental health disorders, sleep disturbances, and stress. And when we're stressed, we're more likely to treat people badly. Studies have shown that we're more likely to make unethical decisions, to behave untrustworthy. So what can we do about it? How can we break this cycle and be more fully present in our lives? Well, what I'd like to suggest is that sometimes to be really, truly connected, we need to turn our phones off. I've been very fortunate that my work has often been about taking people to someplace new or exotic, a so-called once-in-a-lifetime adventure. But the thing I found most rewarding about this kind of work was seeing the change in my clients over the course of a week, over the terrain of, say, a mountain, meeting them at the airport, all stressed and anxious and agitated, and then seeing their transformation as suddenly life becomes very simple for them. Not easy, but simple. Physically demanding, but simple, without having to worry about what's happening later or what's happening tomorrow, and with no 3G connection for distraction. They just need to focus on putting one foot in front of the other and immerse themselves in their surroundings. And I would witness this kind of involuntary letting go as people realise there's no more important place to be than right now. Meetings, politics, and deadlines are increasingly hard to fathom when you're in a meadow looking up at the Himalayas. And there's a wealth of evidence-based research as to why the outdoors makes us feel better. Studies have shown that when we're around nature in the outdoors, our breathing slows down. We're less it reduces anxiety and stress. Studies have shown that it's good for our immune system. It increases the amount of virus and tumour-fighting white blood cells. And by removing ourselves from the overstimulated environment of city life, we can relax, and it improves our cognitive functions, our attention and our focus. But people often say to me, I'm just not an outdoorsy person. And I beg to differ. For 3.5 billion years, our ancestors have evolved in the outdoors, in these great big open spaces, only really moving into more urbanized lives in the last few hundred years on a massive scale. So the outdoors is in our genes. Or as the Scottish naturalist John Muir puts it, going into the mountains is going home. And I would witness, and I would send my clients home happier, healthier versions of themselves. And I even felt a bit smug that this guy in his early 20s, I felt like I'd found this harmony in my life that seemed to elude my clients, these seemingly successful people. But fast forward a few years, and the harmony in my life had changed a little bit. I was living in London. I was still in this industry, but leading an operations team in a busy and rapidly expanding events and expedition company. I loved my job, but for the first time, I was office-bound and I was desk-bound, and I found I just couldn't switch off. I was always thinking about work, always planning, scheming, sleeping poorly, and when I did have time off to spend with friends and family that I rarely saw, I was at best only semi-there, checking my emails obsessively. I used to try and go for a run to clear my head, and I'd put my headphones in, crank up Eminem, and just disappear into the reruns of conversations of the day, fantasies about conversations tomorrow or confrontations and things that just never happen. You see, when you're leading an expedition, it's very much a 24-hour-a-day gig. You have breakfast, lunch, and dinner with your clients. There's no going home at the end of the day. The best you can really hope for is a few solitary hours in your tent. But even then, you can be interrupted by a client with an issue, as I have on numerous occasions, by clients who are homesick because they've got the runs, because they need help removing a leech from a place they can't see without a mirror. I once removed 24 leeches from the legs and backside of a large American gentleman, too busy on his BlackBerry to heed my instructions. It took me about a quarter of an hour and 3 or 4 Marlboro Lights to burn each one of those suckers off. But he learnt his lesson. Don't wear hot pants in the jungle. If you take nothing else away from TED today, it's there. But I found I was applying this 24-hour mindset to life in London with negative consequences for myself and those around me. I spent my birthday in Sri Lanka one year, and my wife had picked this idyllic spot by the beach, looking out on the Indian Ocean. She'd even made my name in the sand out of seashells. But I wasn't in the moment with her. I was just staring out to sea, thinking about, who knows what. And when I did come back to the present, I looked at her and saw tears in her eyes, and it seems I hadn't heard her say, "Happy birthday," or I love you. Not long after that, ironically, through my smartphone, I came across a YouTube clip of a man called Jon Kabat-Zinn talking about something called mindfulness. And I'd heard of mindfulness. I had dabbled with meditation when I lived in India and Nepal. But there was something about this professor of medicine, this scientist, talking about it that really resonated with me. Jon Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention on purpose to the present moment and non-judgmentally. Essentially, it's just the practice of paying attention. Something we are all phenomenally bad at. A Harvard study from 2010 concluded that we spend 47% of our waking lives thinking. 47%. And these aren't the innovative thoughts that find cures for diseases and new inventions. These are, on the whole, default autopilot. Stories, narrative, and noise. Simply put, we spend half of our lives not being present. And that's worrying when you think that the only time in your life that you ever experience anything is in the present moment. The only time in our lives that we can affect any kind of change is in the present moment. So I started by practicing paying attention to really quite simple things like my breath or a sensation or a sound. And over time, I was able to pay attention to more complex things like my thoughts, my emotions. I learned to become an observer of them rather than a reactor to them. We hear sports teams increasingly talk in terms of marginal gains, how if you improve everything about your team, so your equipment, your nutrition, your environment, the way you sleep, the hygiene, everything, the incremental impact of all those tiny improvements is enough to take a championship. And of course, the inner game is a big part of that. Sports psychologist George Mumford has cited mindfulness as an integral part of the training that he gives to the Los Angeles Lakers. But the more I practiced, the more the parallels between the lessons I learnt in mindfulness training and the lessons I had previously learnt from my adventures in the great outdoors but had forgotten became really, really quite obvious. When you're in the outdoors, you're taking on some sort of challenge in the outdoors. There's three things that you learn very, very quickly. One, you can't control your environment. If it rains or if a landslide blocks your path, you plot a new course or you accept it, but there's really no point worrying about it. You learn how to keep moving forward, whatever the challenges, and ignore the inner doubts. And you learn how to focus on really simple things like a footstep, just being curious about it, how it feels, so that you can avoid ending up on your backside. When you try and meditate for the first time, for say even 10 minutes, your mind will throw up all these sorts of doubts. Very similar doubts, as it turns out, as in the middle of the night, when you're cold and you're attempting to summit Kilimanjaro, or do anything out of your comfort zone, like give a TED talk. Things like, this is ridiculous, you're going to make a fool out of yourself. Things like, you've still got so far to go. You should stop. You should give up. And if you pay attention to these things and you let them snowball, you probably will submit. But if you can learn to observe these things coming and going without forming any attachment to them, then you can overcome significant challenges. As Muhammad Ali famously said, it isn't the mountains ahead to climb that wears you out, it's the pebble in your shoe. It's those little niggling thoughts that will have you turn around and head back to camp. Now, there's no prize for meditating for an hour, just like there's no pot of gold at the top of the mountain, and neither will change the world, but they might change you and give you the physical and mental dexterity to tackle the real challenges in your life, which are always at home, your careers, your being a parent, being a spouse. What mindfulness teaches us, and what the outdoors can be a conduit to, is an appreciation for the present moment. You can spend your holidays ticking off the latest kind of top 10 tips from the glossy travel magazines, visiting these once-in-a-lifetime destinations, or searching for deeper connections by doing yoga in Costa Rica or a juicing retreat on the Med. But strip it all back, and you can cultivate these same moments and practice these same connections as easily in the UK, in London, even in Essex, if you just pay a bit more attention. And if we can reduce that figure of 47% just a little bit, so we're more attentive at home, at work, with our friends, then these are the marginal gains that will make our own lives so much richer, fuller, and more colourful. So for anyone here that, like me, thinks you might be addicted to your Crackberry or your iPhone, I suggest we all go outside and engage in an activity no more complex than hiking from A to B or climbing this or cycling from here to there, but something that requires you to go beyond your known limits, to get uncomfortable and to repeatedly ignore those inner doubts and limiting beliefs. I still organise challenges for a living, and they're always evolving as people are trying to push themselves further and higher, but there's a challenge for everyone, and people always come back as they become a kind of annual thing, a necessity, a kind of reboot for the soul, and they've become that once again for me. And you don't need to go far to have these kind of adventures. The UK has scenery and geography as dramatic as anywhere on the planet. I travelled all the way to Patagonia to see lakes and mountains like these. I didn't realise they had them in Wales at the time. If you haven't been to Snowdonia, go to Snowdonia. The Great Wall, Hadrian's Wall. The Lake District, the Peak District, the Isle of Wight. The UK has so much to explore. And if you can't get out of London, don't forget that most of us live and work in one of the most verdant cities of its size anywhere on the planet. 50% of London is comprised of green spaces. We have more than 8 million trees, hundreds of miles of public footpath. The most important thing is that wherever you go, you are there 100%. Turn your phones off. Turn your attention on. Don't remove yourself from the moment by viewing it through the lens on your phone's camera. As Ferris Bueller poetically put it, life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and look around once in a while, you could miss it. Thank you very much.